It's a misnomer to say I've retired. I've just moved into a different venue. I had never any intention of doing graphic novels or going into noir. But since I lived, as it turns out, a biography that was made up and part of what noir is made up of, where things happen which you can't divine, where you're surprised continually and upended by people you trusted who didn't turn out to be who they were. That's noir, but that was also my life in the years of the Cold War. I mean, what began it, in a way. After I got out of the Army in January of 1953, sometime after that, briefly after that, a few months, I read about a memorial service that was going to take place in Brooklyn for the actor J. Edward Bromberg, who was a pioneer member of the group theater, which was a left-wing theater in the 1930s and 40s. He went out to Hollywood. He was a Red. He got blacklisted. He lost his means of making a living, and he died of a heart attack, broke. And there was this memorial service. Now, as a lifetime left liberal, I made my way out to Brooklyn to go see this memorial service. And it was the usual people on the left speaking, and some of them were just wonderful. But the surprise, a speaker who hadn't been expected there was a writer, whose name many of you, I'm sure, will to just lose the... Did we die?
My husband says, what's going to happen today?
I can shout.
No.
How many mics we got? The surprise speaker announced was a legendary writer who wrote wonderfully innovative plays on Broadway and then abandoned it all for Hollywood and was considered a sellout, a man named Clifford Odets. And Odets had written Awake and Sing, he had written Golden Boy, he had written a number of brilliant plays, then he went to Hollywood and pretty much forgot about politics, and now here he was, in the height of McCarthyism, where anybody spoke up against what was going on in the country was in danger of losing his living. And there he was talking about his friend Joe Bromberg. He talked about it movingly, emotionally. Everybody had tears in their eyes. I certainly did. And then he began denouncing the House Committee on Un-American Activities in tones that were very much in keeping with the best writing he had done on the Broadway stage. It was perfectly phrased, all off the cuff, glorious, poetic, soaring prose about the un-Americans and how they were, what they were doing to this country and how they were going to lose, we were going to win. And everybody in the crowd was on its feet, screaming and yelling. And I was just inspired. And then a week later, Clifford Odets, my hero, appears as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activity.
This is bizarre.
I'm stamping on it, I find those.
It's absolutely ridiculous. I'm going to put another battery just in case it's battery. Just keep
that
going.
one.
We can hear you. We can hear.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Then be quiet. And then a week later, after this moving variation on J. Edward Bromberg, Odets appears as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee, gives all the names of all of the people he knew in the Communist Party when he was a left-wing playwright, and said and asked who recruited him into the Communist Party. Says J. Edward Bromberg, the man whose memorial he spoke of just a week earlier. This was, to say the least, in my 20s, an epiphany, because it just threw me, as it would anybody, for a loop. I wondered, what is this world I'm living in? Who can you trust? Who is real? Who is unreal? What's going on around here? And that was, for those of you, and many of you did living through that Cold War period, if you were on the left, that was a norm of those days. You didn't know what was going on. A few years later, I was living in Brooklyn Heights in 1957, after I began my comic strip in the Village Voice. I'd become friendly and was hanging out with a number of Brooklyn artists, and met with them a painter, an older man. I mean, we were in our late 20s by that time, and still kids. And all of us young, all of us liberal left, all of us idealistic. And this older man who was a retired photo processor, his name was Emil Golfus, and he came from Canada, and he spoke in a funny kind of accent. And he was very sweet, and we thought rather naive politically, but he stayed out, he just liked to hang around with artists. And he was in our company for a couple of years, and all of us liked him and trusted him. And then one day I came home and picked up a newspaper, and there was a headline, "Master Russian Spy." And Emil Golfus, my friend, and our friend, turned out to be Rudolf Ivanovich Abel, the most important Russian spy ever arrested in this country. And once again I asked, what's going on here? And it seemed to be part of the life of that time, and perhaps all time, that whatever people said they were not necessarily those people. And so without turning unduly cynical or going in a hole and hiding, one had to figure out, how do I deal with this? How do I go on being idealistic, having certain principles, believing in people, believing that things can work out, in a world in which you're upended, it seems, every 15 minutes by people you thought was one thing becoming another. And much of my work as a political cartoonist and as in fact, I was nothing but a political cartoonist, because when I did sex cartoons, they were political. Nothing is more political than what goes on between men and women, particularly when they're young. When I did family cartoons, Jesus, if family is not politics, and the in and outs of politics, then none of you have ever watched The Sopranos. That everything was politics, and behind the politics was a use of language and a use of words which often meant one thing, or said one thing and meant another. I copied down today one of the early strips I did in 1960. This older man is sitting on a chair. He says, "I used to think I was poor. Then they told me I was needy. Then they told me it was self-defeating to think of myself as needy. I was deprived. Then they told me deprived was a bad image. I was underprivileged. Then they told me underprivileged was overused. I was disadvantaged. I still don't have a dime, but I have a great vocabulary." And that, in one form or another, was the basis for my cartoons. They weren't about hypocrisy or cynicism or bad guys and good guys. It was mainly about, and this is what eventually made me a writer. Mainly, it was about language and the misuse of language, and the fact that we speak in code from the time we are raised as children. We know that we are being talked to in code. Our parents talk to us in code. Our teachers certainly talk to us in code. Our friends even talk. We know at a very early age when your mother says one thing and means something else. And you acknowledge that and you expect that. But when you blow it and you say what you really mean, that's not what they get very angry. They get very upset, because you're supposed to know the code and acknowledge the code and live by the code. The one thing you're not supposed to ever do is speak about the fact that there is a code. and what you are now saying is the opposite of what the truth really is. When you say that, you get handed your head. And because I'm essentially a masochist, I made a career out of saying those things in my Village Voice cartoons. And then when I did that for over 40 years, and then I went into theater and did much of the same thing in plays like Little Murders and about sex and carnal knowledge in the movie, and it became basically my life's work until I lived on many years, 50 years or more, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and I expected that I would be living there all of my life. I was very happy. I had a dog. I walked the dog Riverside Drive, which was a block away, and in Central Park, which was a half mile away. I walked 3-4 miles a day. I had a great life. I went to the theater. I loved plays. I wrote plays. It was terrific. And then one day, I woke up, and I was in my mid-70s, and I couldn't walk anymore. I mean, walking a block was I couldn't walk a half mile. It was difficult for me to start walking whole blocks. And I couldn't hear anymore. So when I went to the theater and you wear these dumb things on your head, they didn't do any good. I mean, I could hear a third of the play. What happens? You go to a Broadway comedy, that I heard wonderful things about. And, I'm a professional. I know how these things work. I know how these plays are written. And I know that lines have a certain rhythm. That if there's a lead into a joke, a setup for a joke, it goes da 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 da, and da 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 da. I could hear very well, and then the payoff is da da da, and the audience is screaming with laughter, and I'm looking this way, that way, because I didn't hear a word. And then for serious works, for dramas, it would be the same thing. I just could not. I mean, I could hear just enough to tantalize me into thinking this is a very good play. I wish I were here. Well, you do enough of that, and you realize that this is suicidal. It can even lead to drinking, and drinking did make me hear better because I stopped caring who I. So somewhere along the line, my friend Roger Rosenblatt, a wonderful writer and journalist, started the writing program out at what was then Southampton College, when LIU ran it. And Roger had just seen at that time the New York Times, which announced that I had been fired by the Village Voice because they were paying me too much money. And is there water here?
Water right behind you.
If I lean against this, will I destroy everything?
I think so. It looks strong.
Okay. If I lie down, do you mind if I lie down? No, I'm fine. I'm not. Okay.
Just don't hurt the picture.
Roger called me up, one of the first people to call me up after that Times story, and he said, I'm not interested in your pissing and moaning and self-pity. I want to know what your insurance situation is. And I said, this was in May, I said, at the end of this year, I don't have any insurance. It's over. They wouldn't extend it. He said, well, I'm starting this program out here. You're going to come out here and teach. You get no money because we don't have it to pay you, but you're fully covered. And I said, teach? But I'm not a teacher. He said, you're coming to teach anyway. And I said, how often? He said, once a week or whatever you want to do. I said, what do I teach? He said, anything you feel like. I said, when do I start? He said, stop boring me, and he hung up the phone. And a few months later, I found that I was on the jitney coming from Manhattan out here every Wednesday to teach a 3-hour class that I made up on the spot, just essentially improvised the way I did with all of my work, and called Humor and Truth, the point of which was to take graduate MFA students and show them that whatever the subject matter was, however screwed up they thought their lives were and were in fact, you could find humor in it. I mean, that's where humor comes from, and it has traditionally come from. And how no matter how unfunny a situation was, there was a way of you finding a laugh in it. And at this time, many of the students were, in those days, 20 years ago or so, burnout cases. They'd come out here because their lives are they suffered divorce, they'd been drinking or drugging, one thing or another, and they'd start writing about situations which I would assign them, and then I'd go over the papers and show them what could be funny, where and suddenly they could write about these death-like situations and get a laugh out of it, and it affected them, and it affected me to know that I could affect them. And so the accident of me taking a job to cover my insurance, which originally a job I didn't think I could have any interest in at all, began to change my life. And as I affected their lives, I found that my being out here, coming every week, I got hooked on my need to be able to communicate with them some other version of life that could affect them, and by that they were affecting how I saw my life. And then when I woke up one day, as I said, and I was 78 years old, and I couldn't walk the dog, or I could, but it would take between West End Avenue and Riverside Drive, 1 block, it would take me 7 or 8 minutes, and everything became harder. All the things that I had loved about the city, all of the things that had made me want to be in the city, I now discovered, moment by moment, day by day, were beating the crap out of me. The city was kind of laughing in my face, snorting at me, stomping on me, and I couldn't fight back. Part of living in the city, and the wonderful dynamic that goes with living in the city, is that it demands that you cope, and when you're young enough and snotty enough, you can cope, and you can face these challenges, and now I couldn't face any one of them. And I decided it was time to leave town, to get out of Dodge, because I was getting shot up in Dodge, and I had no idea. And since I didn't know where else to go, my home on the Upper West Side was no longer the place for me for other reasons besides age, but age was a monumental part of it. I had a summer house on Martha's Vineyard, but I had to be near New York because of my children and because of my work, which continued. It seemed to me to make sense to move out here. And when I moved out here, really as a change of venue, which I didn't think made a hell of a lot of sense, other than I had no place else to go, like a lot of my students. I suddenly took on a new existence. I mean, that because I couldn't, or felt forced to stop writing plays because I couldn't go to rehearsals that I couldn't hear, I started thinking of other forms to work in. And out of nowhere, I began a couple of years ago to think in terms of writing a graphic novel. I had written in the long cartoon form before, and narrative stories of one kind or another. But all of them were consistent with the satiric, funny approach that I had used all of my working life since the 1950s. They were satires, they were drawn in a minimal cartoony style, which was the style I had adopted back in the 50s, and with certain modifications kept for the 40 plus years that I worked in cartoons. But the kind of politics I'd love to do, the kind of social comment I'd love to do, I had basically worked my way out of. The comic strip and The Voice had become stale long before I was fired, and I was looking for something else to do, and fortunately I was fired, and I was forced to move into something else. Or retire, which I couldn't afford to do because I had these mouths that was hanging around that I had to feed. So I started fooling around with other kinds of writing, and I thought I would write some kind of potboiler suspense book that would make me a zillion dollars. I've always had these ideas. They never work. And I'll do this. It'll take 2 months. I'll be rich. Needless to say, that's because I'm an American. That's the way we think. And I began thinking of writing this suspense story. And I didn't know what it was going to be. I didn't know how it was going to be. I wasn't sure what the form would be. But I just started jotting notes and writing down scraps of dialogue the way I always did with all my work in plays or comics or whatever, without a real idea or a real plot. I just started making notes and having people have conversation. I found in my work that, at least the way I work best, to the extent I had any method at all, was not to get too far ahead of myself, not to write down copious notes or outlines of ideas, not to have a tightly structured plot and then start writing the book. Because once I started writing the book that way, I found that I didn't want to write the book because it was boring. Because I knew what was going to happen. I'd already written notes, and before, so there were no surprises. And I didn't want to be just the creator of this work. I also wanted to share in the excitement as a member of the audience. And as a member of my own audience, I didn't want to know what was going to happen necessarily before I did it. So I started writing this and started coming up with story ideas, and it kept surprising me. And in a way, what happens is you create these characters, as I did, and they surprise you. They take over the book. But they were writing, I mean, the world of noir relates directly to all of the things that I had went through in the Cold War 50s. The Rudolph Ivanovich Abel and Joe Bromberg stories and now Clifford Odets, that you think there's one thing and then there's another. That the movies that were so popular after World War II, the beginning of noir, was Robert Mitchum or somebody else comes home from fighting the war and he discovers that his best friend Robert Ryan has run off with his girlfriend. And every GI who came home in movies after the war had a girlfriend who he was going to go home to marry, and everything changed, and she'd gone off with some rich slacker, a draft dodger, something like that. So everything that, or the private eye films, in which the client who comes in says she's one thing and she's somebody else, and the case she's hired you for is about one thing, but that turns into something else. So that the noir was a kind of a fictional replication of the lives that so many of us came to acknowledge in those cold and post-Cold War years. That things weren't quite what they were supposed to be on the surface, and the beauty of the private detective fiction is he could, in the end, this tough guy, however beaten up he got in the process, put all the pieces together and make sense of it, and that's all we really wanted in a world in which we found ourselves battered from one end to the other and confused from one end to another. We wanted something to make sense, and this kind of fiction at least helped us by making sense of things. And so this book I fell into, as I fell into so many things, played that part. It just acted out the end game in a life in which I was continually confused, continually upended, and now I was going to turn it into a work of fiction with pictures, and explain it all to myself, even though none of it was true. But at least I'd be happy. And that's what I did with Kill My Mother, a book that I thought I would first just write and find somebody else to illustrate, because I don't know how to illustrate in that style. And then my editor forced me to try, and he liked what I did, and that became the drawings. And over again, day after day, as I did the book over a 2-year period, drew it, convinced that I can't do this, I'm unqualified, the book worked. And it became a huge, huge joy in my life. And then came out and got a front page review in the New York Times, and now is about to have this exhibition at the Parish starting next week in Watermill. Who knew? And as importantly, most importantly, I'm going to work on the second book now, and I'm not scared anymore because I know I can do it. And so at 86, I'm having more fun with my work than perhaps I've ever had in my life. So I guess I haven't retired. Do you have time to any questions?
Not really.